When you do a co-hosted podcast, there are more things that you need to think about other than just whose microphone is which. So today I'm bringing on Kristine to talk about what we've gone through on the Kris and Kristine show, trying to figure out whose role is what and figure out this whole thing about podcasting.
Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? Thank you so much for being here. I am Kris, and I am from the original Kris and Kristine Show podcast, and this is Podtastic Audio, the show that I've created to help you, yes, you, create an amazing sounding podcast for your audience. Let's deliver the magic, and here I am delivering it to you. And speaking of magic, you know what makes the Kris and Kristine Show so fantastic? I know you're probably thinking it's probably Kris, but also better than just Kris alone. We have Kristine. Now, wouldn't be Kris and Kristine without Kristine. So why don't I bring Kristine into the studio to discuss. How you doing today, Kristine?
Ooh, surprise everybody. I'm actually here. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you today.
Yeah, I got you live in the flesh. We worked out the deal, talked to our who was with your agent?
My agent, I know. You came in a little bit lowball estimate, but I'm glad we were able to come to an agreement. And, thanks for, coughing up the coin.
And speaking of coughing up the coin, I think coffee was the coin every morning to have you on the show. So
yeah. I think about that when we have coffee in the mornings is I wonder what it would be like if we just put a microphone between the two of us and just literally recorded everything that we talk about in the morning. It's so random, but could you actually make an episode out of it?
I think some people actually do. They try to. Podcasting, people can podcast about whatever they want or anything they want, and sometimes they do. And I know that during the great days of 2020, COVID days, where everybody was locked down, just bored, talking about whatever, and of course doing the whole Zoom chats and all kinds of funsy stuff, a lot of shows kind of went down that path.
Right.
Not many of them are around today, but
they pod faded.
They did the old pod fading. Well, we haven't pod faded. We're still here.
We haven't. And we definitely haven't faded. And, the fact that I'm here with you in the flesh, talking and doing yet another episode this week should just speak to my commitment to you, my trusty co-host.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Speaking of podcasting, there's probably, I would say maybe like 3 different styles of podcasts that people probably can do. 3 different formats, really. There is the solo format, where it's just one person talking directly into a microphone, just delivering the goods, just one person. Usually those episodes are a lot shorter than like longer hour or 2-hour interview style of shows, which brings you to interview shows, which are the second, like I would say, popular format to do a podcast. It's where it's, you talking into a microphone or whatever, and you have a guest coming in through either a Zoom call or something along those sorts, and you're taping the whole thing, and you're having a conversation, asking questions, all the great usual stuff you see with an interview style podcast. And the third style, I would say what we're doing like right now today, is a co-hosted style of a podcast where there's 2 people on the same show talking about something that they, are into, or maybe they're not into, but it's a co-hosted podcast.
Yeah, I think that one of the ones that I'm thinking about right now that's most popular that everybody's been talking about on social media are the Kelsey brothers, Travis and Jason Kelsey.
Right, yeah.
And they do a remotely co-hosted podcast. And I think theirs is mostly video, but do they upload the audio only to podcast platforms?
I would think they do. Yeah, I've heard. Yes,
do you think they produce it themselves?
Oh, probably not.
Yeah.
I think you get to some level, you probably just roll in here and just say, where's my microphone? My microphone's not set up correctly. Where's my headphones? Whatever I got to do. And they just sit down and talk, and then they just walk out.
Actually, Jason Kelsey does it at his house.
Okay, well,
yeah,
I'm sure.
He has a studio because he's pulled in his little girls before, and they've been it's around bedtime, so I do know that. But yeah, I get the concept of they probably have a team that's helping them with like the production aspect of it in some way.
Yeah, I think a lot of shows that have money, or at least people who have money who do this kind of stuff that I've seen, even the independent shows, they will have like, they'll come in, they'll have their gear, their camera work, everything set up, and they will do their show. But yet they send it off to a team. Now, this team that works on the editing, they may not even be in the United States. They could be somewhere else overseas, and they get all of the video and audio and they chop it up and put little segments together.
Yeah, but you know what's unique about all of our shows and the shows that are on our website and everything, and I don't know if everybody realizes this, I'm going to like humble brag right now, is you actually do all of that work for us. You produce this podcast episode, you produce the ones for your clients, and you produce the Kris and Kristine show. And you do all of the recording and all of the editing and all of the post-production and all of the promoting. And I get to just show up and shine.
Well, that's why you are the VIP of the show. You are like the celebrity of the show.
Well, we thought for today, as you and I were talking a little bit about Podtastic Audio, one of the things that would be fun to chat about is like, how do you run an effective podcast when you have a co-host? Because anytime that you have two people involved with something, it takes a certain amount of teamwork and coordination. And let's be real, it's not for everybody. There are certain people that the single person podcast is probably the better route for them, or the interview podcast. But as I was looking at my Facebook memories, we've actually been at this for 4.5 years now. Can you believe that?
Wow. 4.5 years of doing this podcasting thing, It's
I know.
crazy.
And so we've had to go through a real growth process on how to effectively do this in a way that actually brings people in to our life and our story. And how do we, as co-hosts, do things like facilitating interviews? Because it's not like we just show up and turn on the recordings and go at it cold. Like there's different coordination. So I know you have some things you want us to talk about. Like, what is it that makes our dynamic work? But I thought that maybe we could start off, before we get into your list, about like, how do we work together? What did it take to get to know each other and our styles so that we could be effective?
Well, listen, first off, I'm always still working on it. I'm not perfect, like trying to figure out the different cues on who's going to say what and this kind of thing. And it always works best when you are physically in the same room, and versus like a Zoom call or something like that. There's just something to it. Like being physically present in the same space with another person talking, it always trumps like any other format, whether it's a phone call or a Zoom call, things like that. That helps out. As far as knowing the person, it does help to really kind of understand the person you're going to have. If it's going to be a co-host, you really got to know them, and you got to know like whose role is with the show, like who's kind of going to do what part, who's not going to do this, who's going to do that. It's always kind of a power struggle sometimes, because when you do have two people with like dominating personalities,
what are you saying about me?
On the microphone, and you're both kind of like struggling for like mic time, I would say. You have to figure out a way to balance that out, because there's going to be a time when, if you do a co-hosted show, one of the co-hosts are going to be more, let's just say, a ball hog or a mic hog than the other. You know what I'm saying?
I think that's your perspective, is that it's about like jockeying for position. And I would say that that's something that we have had to negotiate around, because I don't intentionally need to be heard. There's times when I want to be able to contribute a point, but early, let's like float back in our podcasting journey. We had to, before each episode, when we first got started, because I think it's important context. We started this podcast after we'd been together for only had we even been together for a year? I think we had been.
Yeah, probably about a year.
I think because we started it in August. And so we started dating in June the year prior. So we were still very early in our relationship of learning our cues. We weren't living together. We were seeing each other mostly on the weekends, and our relationship at that time was lived on the weekends because you were working during the week, I was working during the week. And so it was this, starting doing the podcast, me feeling a little bit miffed about like it's taking quality time away from us doing other things, and I don't want to do this work, but I didn't want to let you down, and I was still trying to be like the sweet girlfriend and impressing you.
Oh, really?
And
Oh, thank you.
I was trying to, but then what started to happen was that for some reason, and this was my perspective, so I could be completely wrong, you started to try and compete with me for mic time. And then like when we started to have guests, there would be this, well, who's going to do the intro? And we had to make sure we alternated it every other time because you got very upset when you thought I was doing the intro more than you. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what was it that made you feel threatened?
Well, okay. Well, I don't know if I felt threatened. I just felt like that maybe if we're going to be a team on this, if it's going to be you and me, the co-hosted team, a balance beam of the show, that I think it should balance out where it wouldn't be all of this or all of that, all of you leading or all of me leading. It would be a even balance of both. So I say, well, if you did it last week, I should do it this week, and then so on and so forth. That's the way I was looking at it.
And how have we evolved since then?
I pretty much let you do it now.
And the reason for that is because what we started to realize was by having you have to prepare to do the guest intro, it was keeping you from being focused on the technical stuff, which was impacting our ability to have all of the audio dialed in. And by me being able to take on the intro, it allowed you to cue the applause that we incorporate. Also,
hey, those are real people we bring in the studio, honey.
I know, but you still have to, you have to cue them with the applause card,
oh, that's true. Yeah, that's
right?
true,
You have to like raise that up like they do in like Jimmy Fallon. But you have to be able to cue the applause and make sure that the guest comes in and they're okay and there's no like mic bleed. And then when we were alternating and you were having to like turn around and like click something on the keyboard and come back, you'd end up like hitting the microphone sometimes, and then you have to edit that out. So we had to negotiate.
Mess, but it was a clunky mess. We try to like juggle things because the way we do our podcasting in this room here is that the computer and the Rodecaster Pro and all the gear and all equipment, when we are talking like right now, it's all directly behind me.
Right.
So I'm supposed to be controlling these things, and it's behind me so I can face you. When I do a solo show, or I'm doing an interview solo show, or interview client show, or whatever, I'm sitting at the desk. I'm physically facing the desk. I'm at the computer desk, and I can run all the controls live in real time. But when I'm trying to do an interview show and talk to you at the same time, and all the gear is behind me and operate it behind me, it's a little dance. Got to swivel the chair around. You got to make sure you don't bump nothing. Got to make sure that everything is like, where it's supposed to be. Make sure you hit record. That's a big one,
Right. And so when we do co-host together, when you're facing me, I'm facing the screen. So I can see it behind you. I'm keeping track of the time. I can see it over there. I have pretty good eyesight. I'm making sure that all of the different buttons are pushed. And I let you know, like if the computer's starting to fall asleep, I have like a little signal where I'll like tell you to wake it up. But we've had to figure out that routine because we did get to a point where it was like, well, you have to be able to do the technical stuff. And to do that, you had to be willing to give up a little bit of that power of having to switch off doing the intro. And, once you got to that point of realizing that it wasn't about me trying to hog the mic, but it was actually better for the podcast for you to do that, I feel like that feeling of competition went away. Like you just were like, okay, well, this is just the way that it needs to be. And so we have evolved as hosts as we've gotten to know each other as well. Like we have like movements and like cues and visuals and things like that will.
Oh, remember our little visual. What are those?
Oh,
like?
The little paddles. We had these little.
Yeah, I still have them. They were like little
whiteboard.
Yeah, they were miniature whiteboards with little Sharpie. What the whiteboard Sharpie thing you write on them, and we would write on them. Dry erase boards, just like are. And so we each had like 2 or 3 of them. We had written up, and basically wrote on them. What were the things we wrote on them? Was it like I have a question or my turn or? So there was something. Usually, it was basically like I have a question.
Yeah, it was like, I have a question, and we really did have to figure out like what our roles were. I think that's what that comes down to is like who was going to facilitate. I think at that point we didn't have clear roles. We were just trying to do sharing is caring, split everything down the middle, and make sure that you get to ask a question, I get to ask a question. And it was like kind of a ping pong.
Well, that's what it was with our first guest we did, remember?
Oh my gosh, I know. Well, the first guest I had to do by myself because you were working. But yes, our first guest together, do you remember? I think, didn't we sit in the closet to do that or something?
No, we did not. We did it like we did now, but we did it in the old house, of course. But that was when we had an entire script of questions written out, line for line, word for word. We did not. I don't think we ever deviated from that list of questions. It was
Krista Beck, right?
Yes, and it was Kris and Kristine, and it had like it says Kristine and your line, and Kris and my line, and it went alternating down the line. And I don't think they ever really. We may have jumped off script a little bit during the interview process. That's what you should do. Have more of a natural flow to the questions and to the conversation, which what we did. But I was so nervous. I remember that first interview and we did it together. And after we did it, I thought it went very well. I felt very excited. I think I got the bug of the interview bug.
So you know what? That was episode 23. And it was a year ago or 4 years ago last week because it came up on my Facebook memories.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. So when we think of that, if you go back and you listen to that, it should be episode 23 with Krista Beck. And the episode artwork has like this like green and blue and all of that. But if you listen to that, you'll notice that we were just trying to figure out our roles of incorporating interviews. Before that, we were doing like lists and current events, and we hadn't really found our niche within the podcasting flow. I think that what you'll notice with our episode now is they feel a lot more free flowing. And I think that's because our roles in interviews have morphed a little bit. We even tell this to our guests before we start recording, which is I like to be like, I'll research and I like to have a couple of questions in my head and try to help like dig deep into the conversation. And you know that like, I'm going to ask them a question that gets them to go deep. And then once they go deep, you like to like ask the questions that build off of the details and like helps us keep rolling forward. Like I can help trigger the deep conversation, but you keep it moving along.
Well, thank you. That's what I do best. Keep it moving along, baby.
Not moving along, moving along.
That too.
But in terms of responsibilities, when it comes to podcasting, I think this is where we had a little bit of friction because there was a time where just the podcasting itself and the responsibility of having to do it every week felt like it was too much.
Oh, yeah. That goes to burnout, too, because you can get burnt out very easily, especially if you just feel like you have to produce something every week just because it is it's every Wednesday we release an episode, so we have to get something out. And here it is Tuesday night. I don't know what I'm going to do. Let's just throw on somebody on the show and talk about who knows what.
And because we are co-hosts that are also in a relationship, and at the time early on, we were dating. We weren't even engaged yet. Well, we got engaged really early on. That was like episode 8. Right, and we announced it on episode 9.
These different numbers.
You think that I don't pay attention, but I remember.
Okay.
The podcast has milestones. But we were engaged, and what we didn't have is like this clear picture of like where we wanted the podcast to go long term. And so there was this need to produce something every week. And after I'd been working all week, for you, it was so exciting and new and fresh, and you thought it was fun. And for me, it felt like work. And that for a while was pretty hard because when we talk about responsibilities, like the responsibilities of keeping the podcast going, you would want me to do different things like research and put an outline together. And what was my attitude like during that time?
I think at first you were excited to do it because we're talking like early days of the podcast. You were all on board with setting things up, like setting the Facebook page up and different things, which I haven't really got into in a while. But, those kind of things and setting the social media up and figuring out the different, I think you even did the artwork at first, started doing that kind of stuff and even creating some kind of outlines and things.
But then you didn't like what I was doing. And that for me was very hurtful because we hadn't clearly delineated, like, if I was going to do something, then you needed to trust me to do it. It was a baby to you. Like, it was your baby. And so it became I wouldn't say a power struggle, but it became a point of tension to where it made me a bit unmotivated. And so we had some like deep conversations around how do we get things back on track? And what ended up happening is you loosened up a bit.
I did. It took me a while to get there, but that's why Podcastic Audio kind of came out probably around the same time. Also, people were asking me questions about how you and I were doing the show, like how are we creating it, especially with the guests, because at the time anyways, a lot of these shows that would bring on guests didn't sound very good. And some of the co-hosted shows didn't sound good either. They sounded like, like horrible,
right?
Nonsense, Blue Yeti microphones, next room, Echo City,
Yeah.
all that kind of nonsense. And people were asking me questions. How do you make it sound so great? So I say, well, let me create another show, Podcastic Audio, this one right here, to kind of show what we have done on our show, kind of walk through the steps of things that we have done to make sure it sounded great. And it was physically a great show. And I think one of the highest compliments I ever got from somebody was recently they said that the Kristine show, they didn't think that the Kristine show was an independent podcast because it sounded too professional.
Oh, wow. That's a very nice compliment.
It is. And I'm like, really? Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, but I always thought too, is that like, well, remember we were using basic equipment. We were not using the Rodecaster.
No.
We were using this microphone.
No, I even still see my original mic stand over there with all of my rhinestone bling around it that I was hot gluing together.
Yes, because rhinestones hot glued to a mic stand makes all the difference for your audio quality.
It does. But what it really breaks down to is that we had to figure out at the very beginning, like how to communicate effectively. And in those first few months, and I would even say like the first year and a half, maybe even the first 2.5 years, is there was a lot of arguing when it came to the podcast. And I would just I would have so much dread about the podcast because I just knew that there was going to be a fight. And it was because we were trying to constantly, I had burnout. I was burned out at work. And this was all pre-pandemic. And then, trying to figure out what kind of content to produce because we both have very different lenses on the world. And you would have one idea and I'd have one idea and they'd be in direct conflict with each other. And then it's like a power play. And that was hard.
And then also our schedules were also completely different too. Remember, you working days and I was working nights. So I still am working. It's still kind of same thing.
Right.
But it was I think it was Saturday or Sunday nights we were doing it. Do you remember that some nights we were up to like, at least I was up to like 2 in the morning?
You would, yeah. So it was really hard to set boundaries because once we got further in and we had been engaged and then we were getting closer to the wedding, and I had moved in, at the time, the podcasting studio was in the master suite, and there wasn't a wall in between where you sat to do the producing and the bedroom. And then I would have to, prepare to get up for work the next day. And you would be like, oh, I really, really need to get this out tonight. And this still drives me crazy to this day.
Oh, yeah?
But you refuse. It literally goes against everything that like the industry says. You refuse to wear headphones when you're doing editing of a podcast. And I would be trying to fall asleep. And I will never forget this one night. You had it like literally at the highest volume, and it was
It could have been the highest volume.
Oh, it was god awful. 2:30 in the morning, and it was like a mouth noise that I made. And first of all, how do I feel about mouth noises?
You hate them.
Oh my gosh, I hate them so much. Like so much. When people are eating and they do them, ugh. But it was like this. Like that. And that noise right there.
Okay.
But you kept playing it over and over and over again because you were trying to silence it or clip it. But literally it was like 15 times.
That was early in my editing days too, so I didn't know what I was doing.
2:30 in the morning.
Yeah, that's why it took till 2:30 in the morning to do that kind of stuff.
2:30 in the morning, and I'm hearing this mouth noise 15 times. And I was like, for the love of God. And you were like, don't yell at me. You're just laying there and sleeping. And I was like,
you're not doing any real work.
Yeah. So those were some of the conversations, and the communication was nasty at that time. Like it was rough. And we got into those conversations of like where you would feel, well, I don't want to say you would feel, how would you feel that I was being with the podcast?
Well, first off, I felt a lot of pressure that for some reason I heard and I felt that we had to deliver our episodes exactly at the same time every single week or whatever it was to the time, to the day, which meant after I recorded it, I had to immediately go into editing mode and and producing mode. I had to go in one swoop.
Yeah, you would not take a break that night.
And I also was afraid that using the old computer.
Oh my God, that computer.
It's still, it's the old dinosaur computer.
Is it still there?
It's still down there in the little cubby hole. Yeah, it's still down there. It's caved now. It's a little tomb it lives in.
Tomb.
As I put a little gravestone on it now. But it still has the files on it still.
Yeah.
But anyways, I was just afraid that my biggest fear when it comes to eating this kind of stuff, and it's, even to this day, is having files just vanishing away.
Right.
Getting deleted, corrupted, whatever, poof, gone. So what I have to do now is I'm over OCD when it comes to saving files, that I have 3 different places I save files at. I save it on one big hard drive, one small hard drive, and on the computer drive itself. So I'm saving them different places. And back then, I was afraid that the computer would just crash and the file would be deleted before I got a chance to get it up to the media host.
Yeah.
So I'm like, well, I better get, it's like I want to get this, it's almost like it's expiring.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a rush job on the whole podcast, rush it out that same night, feeling that if I didn't get it out that night, the episode would just be gone. And I have to go to the what do you call it? The call of shame, where you have to ask Kristine, hey, honey, that episode got deleted. And I don't know. I tried to get it out there, but the computer ate it and it's gone.
Right. So the pressure that put on the relationship was pretty extreme, because you have, first of all, we would have to wait until the kids went to bed because they were young and they were loud and we needed it really quiet in the household. So that was, challenge number 1. Second challenge was it just started late in the day after we'd already been through our weekend, and I was mentally trying to transition into work mode. But for you, because you work nights, you were just getting into your flow, and it was like no big deal. And so we had that. And then it was this, I have to edit everything and get it out tonight, which came in conflict with my ability to sleep. And then if things didn't go well while you were editing.
How often did that happen?
Every single week. Then you're, F-bombs and this and that. And like, it was really challenging when I would be like fast asleep and There was a part of this time when I still had my apartment. It wasn't like right before the wedding. It was like in the midst of wedding planning. And there were times when we would finish recording and I'd be like, bye, love you. I'll see you on next Saturday or whatever, because I knew that if I stayed, I would get no sleep. And that was really difficult.
And I want to say I'm sorry for that. It's one of those things where it was a learning curve for me trying to figure these things out, figure out the dynamic between both of us, trying to figure out what worked, the workflow. I mean, early on the podcasting journey, I bet every podcaster probably goes through this, is where they're trying to figure out their flow, trying to figure out their own show, and trying to figure out how to piece it all together. And I think that when you're starting out, like we were starting out, I told you at the very beginning that I didn't know if we're even going to continue doing this. It was going to be like a fun little moment in time where we tried a podcast, and I said, well, let me see if I can do this. And I didn't want to spend a ton of money on all this gear and equipment and stuff.
No, you just didn't want to spend a ton of money. Period.
That's true. That is very true. That is very true. But I didn't want to spend a ton of money because I didn't know that we were even going to like it. It's
Right.
like if you're going to try playing golf for the first time, you're not going to buy a $20,000 set of golf clubs.
Right.
You're going to buy that. You might even rent a club or borrow clubs from a friend or something like that, just to get, to see if you even like it, just to get your feet wet and play with it and see. But, I know some people would jump in with, thousands of dollars invested, and then they end up not liking it and they quit and they, either sell the stuff or give it all away. I didn't want to do that. I want to try it and just see what happens.
But one of the things that we were really good about, and I'm proud of this, is that we never got into a fight on the air.
Or if we did, we deleted it, I'm sure.
Right. But I mean, there might have been a time or two where I'd stop talking and you'd look at me and you'd know that I was pissed off. And so you would stop recording the episode. But as much as we bickered behind the scenes and as rough as things were, we really did try to put that aside to produce a good quality episode. And I think that's where it's really important for co-hosts to be on the same page. Is like, it's this mentality that I use in my job too. It's like, disagree privately behind closed doors and support one another publicly. And so like today we're kind of pulling the curtain back and letting people know a little bit of our journey. But for the most part, when you listen to our podcast, other than our snark, which we're snarky to each other a little bit and we kind of jab at each other just a little, but it's not in a way that's designed to like cut the other person down to make you feel like you're not important. Like we'll make little jabs at each other, but it's like to the point of where we know it's not pushing on the other person's insecurity, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And going on that point, I would say what makes a really good co-hosted show is different personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have two people that are exactly the same, agreeing with exactly the same thing, guess what? One of you does not need to be there.
Right.
So what makes shows really intriguing to listen to is a little bit of that disagreeing, a little bit of that conversation, a little bit of like, well, what's your opinion on that? My opinion is this. Your opinion is different than that. Let's discuss. That makes for a great show, especially a co-hosted show.
I agree. And I think that goes to being authentic and maintaining authenticity is by bringing in that like vulnerability and, being yourselves. It allows for the show to be multidimensional because like you said, if you both have the same opinions on things, then you don't want to just talk into a mirror. I mean, well, maybe some people do.
Yeah.
But
hey, looking good looking.
Right. But then it's kind of boring and it's like, yeah, okay, sure. Uh-huh. Versus, helping to keep things lively. And it's interesting because who were we talking about? I think it was just an episode a week or two ago for our show. We were talking about like the dating journey and how, it was our episode with Eric McHugh. And we were talking about his dating, the AI based dating app, and how it helps to find people that have like similar interests. And I told him several times on that podcast is if we were to try and use his app, I don't think you and I would have ever matched because our interests were so different and diverse. But why is it that we work?
Because we do.
I know, but it's interesting because maybe it's that we have like a common belief in just being a good person to one another.
Yes, well said. That's why I have you on the podcast, babe. You know,
I think so. But, when we think about what makes us work as co hosts, we keep each other being authentic.
that is true. Our show is very authentic. We don't try to like, blow smoke or have any fake fluff. And I did an episode on this recently about people that like they're all fake and there's nothing real to the show. And it's all a bunch of like fiction, fake, nonsense. And it's where that if the audience finds out that you have been lying to them the entire time, you're just a phony baloney and you're blowing smoke the entire time, trust is something that is very hard to get and very easy to destroy.
Right.
And
that was profound.
Well, hey, you know what? Hey, that's how I roll, babe.
Yeah.
But it's true. You don't want to lose that trust. And especially even with a co-host too, like you as a co-host, you should trust each other to do the job and bring on and deliver an amazing show, especially a show for the listening audience or even viewing audience, if you're on YouTube too, that they're going to get something out of it. And you always think every time you create an episode, what are they going to get out of it? And is this going to deliver on all fronts? Is it going to be entertaining? Is it going to be educational? Is it going to be, a fun show that you are proud of?
And I think that is one of the things that has allowed us to be successful, if you would call us successful. I would. Is that we both have this priority of producing content that does something positive in the world. So we want to make people think, we want to add value to their life. I don't think there's ever been an episode that you and I have produced just because we wanted to just get on the microphone and talk. Like there are some people that do that and it's like, well, let's just talk. I don't think we have a moral to the story for everything we talk about, but we have a purpose for why we produce it. Whether it's an interview, we want to be able to help that person promote it. Or like, I think we talked about even this week coming up on our show, the idea of not featuring an interview and actually making it all about us and what's our journey to get here, because we haven't actually ever shared each of our stories and how we really found each other and what we went through. And the purpose of that is so our listeners can connect with us. And so that's like what I'm getting to is our authenticity and our desire to like be positive and make an impact on people, I think helps us to stay bonded in our co-hosting.
That's true. And it doesn't always have to be just strictly an interview. I know a lot of shows that do have they interview guests. The sad thing is that you really don't get to know much about the host themselves because they'll say, hey, welcome to the Joe Blow show where we interview cool people about cool things. I'm Joe and my guest today is Jack. Hey, Jack. And they just go straight into Jack's stuff. And you know nothing about Joe, the host, in my theory here. So what we try to do is make sure that we have equal time on the mics and also to the audience, they get to know equally about us, as a team and as a couple and as people and as family and everything else too, because I think that's part of life and us and our journey is equally important as to whoever we bring on. And sometimes I've been told by some of the listeners that a lot of the guests they're not fans of. They'd rather hear us.
They like us.
They'd rather hear us. They tell us that in person. Like, we like hearing you. And if a guest comes on, we'll skip through them, listen a little bit of it. We'll skip through them, but we'd rather hear you guys. So that's where us is so important as part of the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know that, we've been talking a long time, but before we wrap it up, one of the things I really did want to talk about is how we overcome challenges as co-hosts and how we navigate around them. Because if you look at our journey and we're over 180 plus episodes into our podcasting journey and 4.5 years of living through a global pandemic, multiple sicknesses, family tragedies, deaths, lots of different things going on with the kids, is how do you think we've navigated challenges?
Are you talking in general or in the podcast specifically?
In the podcast specifically.
Well, I think what I had to learn to do is to say, it's okay if you take a break. It's okay to take long pauses, and it's okay. I know some people will disagree with me and say, no, I'll never taking a break. I'm doing it every Monday, every Tuesday, every whatever day it is. And I'm nonstop, keep on going. And I even tried for a minute there thinking the same logic. And I would insert like those little, what do they call them? Like filler episodes or little like, we had an episode that was basically like a recap episode of an older episode and just kind of put that together as a package, just kind of fill in that week. And I was doing that for a hot minute, thinking that's what needed to happen. But then I realized that, there's podcasts that I listen to, that I subscribe to, where they take breaks out of no reason and they come back. And it's like, oh, they're back all of a sudden. Great. And they show up in my player. We've taken some long breaks before with our show, and that's okay. In fact, the last break we took, I remember that a listener told me out of the blue, randomly, said, oh, hey, I see you guys are back to podcasting again. It showed up my phone. Like, oh, yeah, we did. We just got a new episode out like yesterday or whatever day it was.
Mm-hmm.
And this was after taking like a couple month break, out of nowhere. So even though you take a break,
we've never taken a couple months break.
Whatever it was, the gap. Basically, I'm saying is that if they never like removed your podcast from their phone player, from their podcast app, when you come back, it automatically will pop up in their feed. It's like, oh, check this out. Almost as if it's a brand new show all over again. Boom, there it is. Mm-hmm. So, I'm not taking long breaks, but it's okay to take a break every once in a while. It's okay to publish on different days. It doesn't always have to be Monday at 6:00 or whatever it has to be. It does not have to do that. It's your show. You can change the format however you want.
But what did it take, Kris, for you to get to that realization that you could release the pressure on me? Because let's be real, that pressure to produce quality content every week was, for me, it was suffocating. And we've talked about this, so this isn't news. And I know we've worked through these feelings about it, but what did it take for you to come to that realization?
I saw that you were struggling, and I saw that it was really upsetting you. And I saw that there were points where I could tell that you wanted to end the show and that you felt like it was too much and it was too demanding. And I think that keeping, especially with all the different things you had going on with your work, with the kids and your different things, and then doing the wedding business and then doing the consulting thing you do and then everything else and all the different things and stuff. And I can see where it can be a lot of pressure to try to deliver another thing on your plate.
Mm-hmm.
It's just another thing you got to do. And the podcast, although it is a fun thing, it is still a hobby, at the end of the day. It's not a,
what?
revenue.
Did you just call it a hobby?
It's not a revenue generating thing. Mm-hmm. It's not like a job. Now, if you have sponsors on your show and you have deadlines that you have to meet, then if you have contracts that were written out,
right,
saying,
that's a different story.
It's a totally different story.
And I would have oriented differently if we had a legal obligation. But, it was months of me trying to get you to understand why I was lacking motivation. And what you had to learn through this journey was the more pressure you put on me to show up and to be a quote unquote good co-host, the more resistant I was, because I felt like I had no choice and that I was being forced. But the minute that you stepped back and you were like, okay, if we don't produce an episode every week, I'm not going to die. It's okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but it took you a lot of personal work. And let's be real, like you did some deep work on that for several months, because it was, when we've talked about it, you had to get over this feeling of being rejected. But because in your mind, you were telling me like it felt like rejection when I didn't want to podcast with you. But that wasn't what I was saying. It was, I have this other like really heavy stuff that's going on. And we had to figure out how to continue talking through that and to not just put the podcast on the shelf and forget it and not engage in the conversation. We had to keep talking through that whole process. And what it ended up doing was created this really nice space in our relationship to say, we give each other permission to just be tired. And you gave me permission to be tired of podcasting without interpreting it as I hated podcasting. It was like,
Yeah.
because it used to be the same, right? It used to be that whenever I would want to take a week off, what was the message that you were hearing in your head?
Oh, I hate this. I hate this so much. And I don't want to do this ever again. And I'm just so over it, Kris. It almost reminded me of when I was younger and I would want to play a board game with my brothers, my brother. I had one brother. And he's like, yeah, let's set it all up. So I'd get the board game out, get all the pieces, the Monopoly money, get it all divided out. Maybe like not even 1 minute into the game, he's like, nah, I'm over it. I'm done. I'm done. I'm like, what? And I used to be so mad. I felt like I set everything up. I wanted to play with him. I was super excited to play. And then he's like, 1 minute into it, he's like, I'm over this. I want to do something else. And it frustrated me. It kind of took me back to a little bit of that.
Yeah.
When you would say those kind of things, I feel like, oh, I'm all excited to do the podcast. I got everything ready. Let's roll. And then I couldn't do the show without you, just like I couldn't play the board game without a person to play it with. Same concept,
Right.
Same feeling all over again, and made me very upset. And it felt like a personal dig, more just on the podcast itself, but more like on me as a person, that I was not good enough for you to play with.
Right.
Yes.
And that's a really good point, because it really gets down to the crux of this. And I think that this is what can be the death of co-hosted podcasts, is if you don't acknowledge and understand the triggers of your co-host and try, I don't want to say like walk on eggshells, because that's not what we do at all, but validate that that's a trigger. Give your partner the opportunity to feel whatever emotion that is, and then speak truth into that space and kind of interrupt that negative tape in their head. And so we had to get to the point where it's like, hey, Kris, I'm not rejecting you. I don't hate the podcast. I actually don't even hate podcasting. But the reality is I'm really burnt out right now. And I need some breathing room. And right now, this is the only thing that I can think of that can come off of my plate. And then you coming to the point of being like, how about we just set it aside, and when you're ready, we'll pick it back up. Even that message by itself, when I was in the midst of, I went through some really dark stuff last year at work, right? I mean,
Oh yeah, definitely.
it was really dark and heavy. And we don't talk a lot about that, and the impact that had on my physical health and my mental health. But in that moment, I think you realized it was about survival for me. And I was literally on the brink, and you just said, like, at the end of the day, I choose you over the podcast. And for me, that was all I needed. And so we did take a beat. I think there was one point in time where we took like a full 6 weeks off, which I never thought we would do. And then I just said to you, hey, can we do a podcast? And you were like, what?
Yeah.
Sure. Like, okay, like right now. And then I came back to it, and we've been back at it. And my attitude has been different about it, because I feel that it wasn't a demand anymore. It was something that we could do together and have fun doing. And so, I know this is probably a longer episode than you had intended, but it really does speak to the importance of the co-hosting dynamic and choosing well. Some people, I think they'll just be like to their buddy, like, hey, you want to do a podcast with me? And they don't really think about like, what is that going to actually look like 6, 10, 12, 24, 60 months down the line.
Right. And also a big one is probably the main one is also scheduling, because everybody has got different schedules, different lives. In some places, they live in different parts of the country where it's like 3 hours apart, 8 hours apart, 10 hours apart. And you're trying to do a co-hosted show with them and figure out their different lives. Because assuming everybody's got a job and assuming everyone's got school or they've got kids or they've got things they've got going on in their personal little bubble of the world, and then you try to bring in somebody else, trying to merge those bubbles together.
Right.
It works for us because we were here in the same house together.
But even then, it was hard.
That's true. It's true. So can you imagine if we both lived in different areas of the country?
No.
And we tried to do this?
No.
How was that even possible?
Sorry, we would have made it for like 1 year. But, I think the key takeaways here are the pieces of advice that I would have are to, choose your co-host wisely. And I would say that you did.
Okay. If you say so.
Yeah, you chose wisely. And then I think that the other thing I would say is to give lots of grace to your co-hosting partner, because in the middle of podcasting, life is happening too. And so we have to be able to flex around that. What's your advice?
Yeah, like I said, it's basically the scheduling, figuring out the schedules, and also figure out like whose role is what on the show. I got so many nuggets of advice. I can go on for hours, but I think a lot of people too, and another big one I just thought about just now is really if it's a co-hosted show with two people on the same show, it's both people's show.
Because they're co-hosts.
Yeah, it's kind of how it works, I guess. You got to figure out who really owns the show. Like who owns, if things go south, because it's almost like a, what's the thing for marriage when you don't want to you get divorced?
Community property, division of assets? No,
it's when you sign and you get married. The, I can't think. Prenup, yeah. You basically have to have like a prenup for your podcast when you do a co-hosted show. Because I'm just saying, if a show does get popular.
We don't have that.
Because we're married. That's what happens. If you get married, you get part of the podcast.
So this is for non-married co-hosting partners.
Correct. Okay. So say two buddies, John and Jack.
Jock A and Jock Strap.
Yes, the Jock Strap show. Yes. Those guys would have to figure out, seriously have a conversation of like who owns what part of the show, because in the event the show does make some money and get somewhat famous, and if Jock or Jock Strap or whoever doesn't want to be a part of the show anymore for whatever reason.
Yeah, where does that money go?
Who gets ownership of the show? Does it just die up, split off? Or I've heard this too.
That's morbid.
I know. Or I've heard this is that some shows are getting bought out by other shows. They'll just buy them up or get bought. You can sell your podcast. It's even a thing. You can sell our show if you wanted to. But if you do sell the show, who gets the profit from it? It's like splitting a house. Say you and your girlfriend, bought a house together. Who's going to sell it and split it when you leave or you break up? How's that work?
Okay. So I'm going to rein us back in because you just went squirrel.
Well, full-blown squirrel here.
I know, full squirrel mode, but that is good advice, is like knowing clearly who has rights to what. I think that that's less of an issue, but only if it's, but it does go back to the roles and responsibilities. Like have clear roles, have clear responsibilities and all of that. And the bottom line is have fun with it. If you're not having fun with it, you're doing something wrong. Like it shouldn't feel like a bikini wax every time you sit down in front of the microphone.
I wouldn't know personally. I've only got Brazilian waxes when I go in. So,
ooh, all right. Let me check out that booty.
Okay, thank you so much. But this has been a fantastic episode, and I really appreciate you stopping by today to talk all about the Kris and Kristine Show's Dynamic Duo podcast and how we make it happen, make the magic happen.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I look forward to the next podcast episode that we record, which will be tomorrow night.
Tomorrow sometime. Yeah.
Yeah, for our Kris and Kristine show.
So thank you once again for listening. If you have any questions or comments, you always can email me at podtasticaudio@gmail.com. Or you know what you can do is you go straight to the website, which is podtasticaudio.com. And I love to hear your feedback, and I love all your emails you write in, all your comments and posts on social media. I love all that stuff, and thank you so much for listening. Until next time, happy podcasting.